It begins not with a scream, not with a witness, not even with a body. It begins with silence. In the summer of 2016, Darius and Tanisha Coleman, a hard-working black couple from Tacoma, Washington, loaded up their modest SUV and drove into the North Cascades for what should have been an ordinary weekend camping trip. They had lived their lives quietly, raising their only son, Malik, with values rooted in faith, community, and relentless hard work. To neighbors, the Colemans were the kind of family that seemed untouchable by chaos. Stable, honest, the ones you waved to on a Sunday morning. But that image shattered when they never came home. Days passed. Their car was eventually found abandoned near a trailhead at Thunder Creek, tucked deep in the wilderness. Inside, a sleeping bag, some food wrappers, and Tanisha's scarf, as though the couple had stepped away for only a moment. But they were gone. No signs of struggle. No blood. Just an absence so sharp it cut through the Coleman family like glass. For their son Malik, then only 22, the nightmare was immediate and suffocating. He went from graduate school applications and late-night basketball games to searching dense forests with volunteers and hanging missing person flyers along gas stations on lonely highways. His parents, his foundation, had vanished into trees, and he had no roadmap to bring them back. Search parties scoured the area for weeks. Helicopters circled the ridges. Dogs tracked the trails. But the wilderness swallowed every clue. When the official search ended, Malik refused to stop. He printed new flyers, knocked on cabin doors, begged for tips online. But every road ended in silence. For years dragged by, the Coleman's disappearance became one of those stories that circulates in whispers, a mystery that locals bring up in diners, shaking their heads. Maybe they'd gotten lost. Maybe it was a bear attack. Maybe, people speculated cruelly, they'd simply walked away from their lives. But Malik never believed that. He knew his parents. He knew their sacrifices, their discipline, their love. His father, Darius, had worked 30 years as a lead machinery technician, never once missing a paycheck, never once leaving his family hungry. His mother, Tanisha, spent Sundays volunteering at church and evenings helping neighbors with childcare. These were not people who walked away. Something had happened to them. The world might have been willing to forget, but Malik wasn't. And then, 4 years later, the forest finally gave up one of its secrets. It was a logger who found it. He had been clearing storm-felled timber near a remote service road when his saw hit metal. Pushing deeper into brush, he uncovered something bizarre and sinister, a rusted, abandoned wood chipper. Inside its metal teeth, investigators later recovered fragments that were not wood at all, but human. The discovery was grotesque, horrifying, and undeniable. Forensic odontologists were called in, their task as grim as it was precise. From the mangled remains, they extracted a sliver of a silver dental inlay, too small for a traditional bite comparison, but distinct enough to test. They combed through old dental records, examining the minute craftsmanship, the alloy composition, the subtle curvature. The results hit like a hammer. The fragment matched the dental work of Darius Coleman. After 4 years of uncertainty, the truth broke through like lightning. Darius Coleman was dead, not lost, not missing, but violently, intentionally destroyed. For Malik, the confirmation was a death sentence in itself. The agony of uncertainty, that faint hope his parents might one day come walking through the door, was ripped away, replaced with new horror. His father's body had been mutilated, reduced to fragments, and left in the teeth of a machine meant to erase. The case was no longer about a missing persons file. It was a homicide investigation, but the wood chipper only told half the story. Where was Tanisha? Where was the rest of Darius's body? Who would carry out such calculated brutality? Investigators briefly considered a haunting possibility. Could Tanisha have been responsible? Could a marriage under strain, worsened by Darius's recent job loss, have erupted into violence? But the theory collapsed under scrutiny. Tanisha had no history of violence, no suspicious movements, no financial withdrawals. Her entire identity revolved around her family, her church, her community. To kill her husband and then vanish into thin air would have been wildly out of character. And besides, the disposal of a body with such precision, Such cruelty suggested something far colder, more organized. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a message. The authorities began shifting their focus. If Tanisha wasn't the killer, then she too was likely a victim. The wood chipper was the how, but the questions that would haunt Malik Coleman, and soon the FBI, were far more chilling. Why were his parents targeted? And who wanted them erased so badly that their very bones were fed to a machine? For Malik, those questions became an obsession. He couldn't accept fragments of his father as the final chapter. He couldn't live with a case file labeled unsolved. He started looking for answers on his own, and the deeper he searched into his father's final months, the more he uncovered a truth far darker than he could have imagined. Because behind the Coleman family's disappearance was a story not of wilderness accidents or random violence, but of power, of corruption, of a wealthy, untouchable man named Sterling Whitmore, who built his empire by feeding the system with lies. And a chilling realization would soon take shape. Darius Coleman hadn't simply been a victim of Whitmore. At one time, in ways Malik never wanted to believe, his father had been part of the machine. The discovery of the wood chipper should have ended the mystery. For 4 long years, the Coleman family had lived inside a question mark, and now, finally, there was something solid. But instead of answers, it only deepened the shadows. When investigators pulled human fragments from the rusted machine, the forensics team braced themselves for the grisly work ahead. What they found was worse than anyone expected. The remains were partial, incomplete, shattered into pieces so small it was almost impossible to know how many bodies had been fed to the machine. Only a sliver of silver dental work tied one fragment back to Darius Coleman. But there was nothing, not a single trace, that confirmed the fate of Tanisha. That absence gnawed at Malik. For weeks after the results came in, he drifted through his days like a man underwater. The official line was cautious. The investigation was ongoing. The evidence was being processed. New leads were being followed. But Malik knew what it really meant. His mother was still classified as missing, her body, if it existed, unaccounted for. And without her, the story was incomplete. He clung to the tiniest slivers of hope. Maybe she'd escaped. Maybe she was hiding, afraid to come forward. But deep down, he knew, his mother would never abandon him. If she wasn't answering, it was because she couldn't. The public had their own theories. News outlets plastered the Coleman case across headlines. Once the wood chipper discovery leaked, talk shows debated whether Tanisha had snapped, killing her husband before disappearing into the wilderness. Internet forums lit up with cruel speculation. Maybe Darius had been abusive. Maybe Tanisha had finally broken. Malik couldn't stomach it. He knew his parents' marriage. Sure, it had its struggles, mostly financial, especially after his father lost his job. But theirs was a union built on discipline and shared sacrifice. His father fixed broken machines. His mother fixed broken people. They were a team. To twist it into some lurid domestic thriller was an insult to everything they'd lived for. But what ate at Malik most was the way investigators treated the discovery, not as a turning point, but as a loose thread. Detectives interviewed him again, pressing questions about his father's work, his behavior before the disappearance, whether Malik had noticed anything suspicious. The more they asked, the clearer it became. They weren't just looking for who killed Darius. They were questioning whether Darius himself had done something to invite it. It wasn't paranoia. He could see it in their eyes. They talked about the $50,000 withdrawal, the one Malik had discovered years earlier, tucked in old bank statements. They talked about Darius being fired from Whitmore Machinery, the company he devoted 3 decades to. They talked about the silence from co-workers who wouldn't return calls. And in those moments, Malik felt it, the racial undercurrent, sharp and cutting. His parents weren't framed as victims of crime. They were framed as possible participants in it. Black bodies, once again, being weighed down with suspicion even in death. It lit fire in him. He stopped waiting for the police to deliver answers. He started digging himself. Nights found him hunched over old paperwork at his kitchen table, bills, contracts, time cards. Anything that might explain what his father had been caught up in. He tracked down former Whitmore employees, many of them black and brown men who'd once worked alongside Darius. Some agreed to meet him in diners off the highway, voices lowered, eyes darting around as though afraid of being overheard. They all said the same thing. Whitmore ran the place like a kingdom. Accidents were buried. Machines were lost and written off. Men who asked too many questions found themselves suddenly unemployed. And nobody, not a single worker, dared to challenge it. Because Sterling Whitmore wasn't just an employer. He was a man with money, connections, and reach. Malik's chest tightened every time he heard his name. Sterling Whitmore, a man so wealthy and untouchable that his word carried more weight than the truth. The same man who had once sat across from his father in a conference room, shaking his hand. The same man whose company had cut Darius off without warning, citing inventory discrepancies that never made sense. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but not a clear one. Malik felt like he was staring at a puzzle with half the pieces missing. His father hadn't just lost a job. He'd been cut off from something bigger, something darker, and whatever was had led to his death. But Malik wasn't ready for what came next, because as he dug deeper, the shadows started moving toward him. One night, after another long day of chasing dead-end leads, Malik returned to his apartment. His key turned smoothly in the lock, but the moment he stepped inside, he froze. The air felt wrong, unsettled, disturbed. He scanned the room, heart hammering. At first glance, nothing seemed missing. But then he noticed a stack of flyers on his coffee table. The ones with his parents' faces had been scattered, and beside them, in neat, deliberate print, someone had written a single word on one of the flyers. Stop. His stomach turned cold. He called the police, but by the time they arrived, the note was gone. His apartment looked untouched. They chalked it up to stress, told him maybe he'd misplaced it. Maybe a friend had been trying to send a message. But Malik knew better. The forest had given up fragments of his father, but now the city itself was speaking to him. A whisper of danger, a warning that someone out there was watching his every move. And if Sterling Whitmore was behind it, Malik realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about finding out who killed his parents. It was about surviving long enough to tell the truth. The warning note should have stopped him. That single word, stop, had been enough to freeze his blood. But Malik wasn't built like that. He had inherited his father's stubbornness, his mother's unshakable resolve. Fear was real, yes, but silence was worse. So instead of retreating, Malik dug harder. He started with the one clue that had always gnawed at him, the $50,000 withdrawal. The discovery had been accidental, years earlier, when he'd been sorting through his father's old bank statements after the disappearance. Nestled between the routine deposits and bills was an outlier, one massive cash withdrawal, gone in a single transaction, $50,000. No paper trail, no explanation. At the time, investigators had shrugged it off. Maybe Darius had been planning something. Maybe it was gambling. Maybe he and Tanisha had staged their own disappearance. But Malik knew his father too well. Darius Coleman was the kind of man who counted every dime, who reminded Malik to check the receipt after every grocery run. He wasn't a gambler. He wasn't reckless. That money wasn't a plan. It was leverage. Malik went to the bank again, this time armed with a lawyer friend from college who understood how to press without drawing suspicion. The transaction details were thin, but one thing stood out: the timing. The withdrawal happened just 2 days after Darius had been terminated from Whitmore Machinery. 2 days after 30 years of loyalty had been erased with a single meeting. And there was more. A surveillance still from the withdrawal showed Darius at the counter, his shoulders slumped, his face hollow. Behind him, partially captured in the reflection of the bank's glass door, was another figure. A tall man, broad shoulders, expensive suit. Malik stared at the grainy image for hours. He couldn't make out the face, but he didn't need to. His gut told him who it was. Sterling Whitmore. The money wasn't a gamble. It was hush money. The realization hollowed Malik out. His father hadn't simply been fired. He'd been silenced, paid off to keep quiet about something inside Whitmore's empire. Something dangerous enough that Whitmore was willing to hand over cash like that. But if his father had taken the money, why had he ended up dead? The contradiction tore at him. Was Darius trying to walk away from a deal? Had he threatened to talk? Or had Whitmore simply decided that paying wasn't enough? The question spiraled Malik into obsession. He dug through public records, traced shell companies tied to Whitmore, and unearthed whispers of insurance fraud. Millions of dollars in heavy machinery written off as lost or destroyed when in reality it had been stashed away. And slowly, a sickening theory began to form. Darius hadn't just stumbled on discrepancies. He had been part of it, maybe unwillingly, maybe out of fear for his job, but his position as lead machinery technician gave him access to the logs, the serial numbers, the very paperwork Whitmore needed to falsify claims. Darius wasn't just collateral. He was a cog in the machine. The thought broke Malik, the man he had idolized, the man whose calloused hands had built their life, had been tied to Whitmore's schemes, not as a mastermind, not as a profiteer, but as an accomplice, a worker forced into silence by power and privilege. It explained the money, it explained the fear, and it explained why Whitmore might have wanted him erased. But confirmation wouldn't come from documents alone. Malik needed voices, witnesses, people who had been there. That search nearly cost him his life. One evening, after meeting a former Whitmore employee in a diner off the highway, Malik returned to his apartment complex. The underground garage was quiet, its concrete echoing each footstep. He unlocked his car, slid into the driver's seat, and had just reached for the ignition when a shadow detached from the darkness. The first blow came fast, a fist through the open window, knuckles splitting Malik's lip. He stumbled back, dazed, as the car door was yanked open. A man loomed over him, face hidden under a hood, fists like bricks. "Stop digging." The voice growled, low and dangerous. Malik's chest seized. The words weren't a threat. They were a command. The man grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the hood of the car. Pain shot through Malik's ribs. He tried to fight back, but the attacker was too strong. Another blow landed, and the world blurred. Then, just as suddenly, the man released him. Malik collapsed to the concrete, gasping. The attacker crouched beside him, close enough that Malik could smell the leather of his gloves. "This ain't your story," he whispered. "Walk away." And then he was gone. The garage echoed with silence, broken only by Malik's ragged breathing. His lip bled. His ribs ached, but his fear was drowned out by something sharper. Rage. Whoever had sent that man thought Malik would scare easily, that he'd back down. But they didn't understand. The Colemans had built their lives on surviving hardship. His parents had worked themselves to the bone to give him a chance. And now, someone had decided they were expendable, erased for profit, fed into machines like scrap metal. Malik pressed his hand to the concrete, pushed himself upright, and swore to himself. He would not stop, not until every secret Sterling Whitmore had buried came screaming into the light. Pain clung to Malik's ribs for days after the garage assault. Every breath was a reminder. Someone powerful wanted him quiet, but bruises faded. Determination didn't. He went back to work. Not his job. He'd taken leave from that months ago. But the only job that mattered, finding the truth. At first, he thought other workers would rally to him. He imagined a line of men ready to testify, tired of Whitmore's tyranny, finally unburdening themselves. But reality was harsher. When Malik tracked down former employees, men who had once laughed with his father in break rooms, shared beers after long shifts, the conversations ended the same way. "Darius was a good man, but I can't get involved. You don't know who you're dealing with. Whitmore's got people everywhere. Leave it alone." Some wouldn't even open the door. Malik could see them through half-drawn curtains, their eyes darting nervously before the blinds snapped shut. The silence wasn't ignorance. It was fear. A fear so entrenched that even years after leaving Whitmore's payroll, men still flinched at the idea of speaking his name. Malik began to understand what he was really up against. Whitmore wasn't just wealthy. He was untouchable. His empire stretched beyond machinery into local politics, law enforcement donations, even church fundraisers. He didn't just own land. He owned silence. But the harder Malik pushed, the more it seemed the system itself turned against him. Detectives called him back in, their tone sharper this time. They asked about his father's finances, about the missing $50,000, about whether Malik had any knowledge of his father's dealings. One even asked, "Are you sure you want to know what your father was into?" It was a small sentence, but it landed like a punch. The implication was clear. Darius wasn't just a victim. Maybe he was complicit. Maybe, by digging, Malik wasn't uncovering corruption, but protecting it. Worse, whispers began to follow him. Online forums speculated that Malik's obsession with the case was suspicious. Some claimed he had fabricated evidence. Others that he had a financial motive. A few went as far as suggesting he'd staged or would chipper discovery himself to stay in the spotlight. The smear campaign worked its poison quickly. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Church members, once a source of strength, now offered cautious, polite nods. Malik's world was shrinking, trust evaporating. But the most devastating blow came from within his own family. One evening, his Aunt Loretta, Tanisha's sister, pulled him aside after service. She was stern, her voice tight with exhaustion. "Malik, baby, you gotta stop," she whispered. "You're not helping your mama. You're not bringing your daddy back. You're only making enemies. And Lord knows, in this world, a black man don't need more enemies." Malik wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't anger. It was fear. The same fear he saw in the ex-workers and the detectives, in everyone who touched Whitmore's shadow. Still, Malik couldn't shake the truth burning inside him. If he stopped, his parents' lives would remain reduced to fragments in a machine. If he stopped, Whitmore would win. So he pressed on. One night, while combing through old union records, Malik stumbled across a name, Clayton Briggs, a foreman at Whitmore Machinery during Darius's tenure. His record was odd. Sudden promotions, unexplained bonuses, and then a quiet disappearance from the company months before Darius vanished. Malik tracked him down in Portland, living under a different name. It took weeks of calls, messages, and unannounced visits before Briggs finally agreed to meet him. They sat in a dim bar, the hum of neon lights buzzing overhead. Briggs looked worn down, his eyes heavy with regret. "You want to know what your daddy was caught up in?" he said, his voice low, almost a confession. "It wasn't just stolen machines. It was insurance. Fraud. So big you wouldn't believe it. Your father knew too much. He knew where the numbers didn't add up, and he was going to talk." Malik leaned forward, heart pounding. "Talk to who?" Briggs shook his head. "Didn't matter. Word got out he was restless. Whitmore don't forgive restless men. And if Whitmore wanted him gone, well, gone is what he got." The words felt like knives, but Malik forced himself to keep steady. "What about my mother?" he asked. Briggs' gaze flickered, uneasy. If she's missing, then she saw something she wasn't supposed to. Maybe she tried to fight it. Maybe she didn't. Either way, Whitmore don't leave loose ends. The bar fell silent. Malik's throat tightened. But then Briggs added something strange. "Thing is, your daddy wasn't clean in this. He wasn't just a victim. He signed off on numbers, Malik. He looked the other way. He might have hated it, but he was in it. That's why Whitmore paid him off. And maybe that's why Whitmore killed him. You can't be both inside and outside the game, not with a man like Whitmore." The truth hit Malik harder than any punch in the garage. His father, the man who had raised him on honesty and hard work, had been compromised. Maybe not willingly, maybe not proudly, but compromised nonetheless. And now, Malik wasn't just chasing his father's killers. He was chasing his father's sins. As he left the bar, the night air pressed heavy against him. He knew two things with bone-deep certainty. One, Sterling Whitmore's empire was larger and darker than he ever imagined. And two, the deeper he dug, the closer he was drawing to the same fate as his parents. Malik had grown up in the Coleman house, believing it was a sanctuary. The creak of the porch steps, the soft hum of his mother's radio in the kitchen, his father's careful hands fixing broken things at the table. Those walls had always meant safety. But now, walking up to the door after his meeting with Clayton Briggs, the house felt different. Exposed. Fragile. Like even the locks couldn't keep the darkness out. That night, Malik couldn't sleep. Every sound clawed at his nerves. The groan of wood, the whistle of wind through cracked windows. At 3 a.m., He jolted awake to the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He crept to the window, pulling the blinds just enough to see a black sedan idling half a block away, headlights off. He stayed there for hours, watching. The car never moved. And when dawn finally broke, it was gone. The paranoia burrowed deeper. Days later, Malik came home to find his front door slightly ajar. He froze, every muscle tight. He knew he had locked it. Inside, nothing looked stolen, but drawers were opened, closets disturbed. Whoever had been there wasn't after money. They were sending a message. On the kitchen counter, placed deliberately where he couldn't miss it, was a single object. His mother's church necklace, the one she had worn every Sunday. He had never found it after their disappearance. Now it sat on his counter, gleaming like a threat. Malik collapsed against the wall, shaking. It was proof that someone had access to everything he thought was his. His past, his grief, his home, all of it violated. He called the police. They came. They looked. They took notes. But the officer's expression said it all. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing stolen. No cameras nearby. The official report would be thin, perfunctory. The officer's last words lingered long after he left. Sometimes stress makes people see connections that aren't there. You've been through a lot. It wasn't just indifference. It was dismissal, a subtle way of saying, maybe the problem was Malik himself. And that was the cruelest part. Whitmore didn't just use violence. He used the system. Malik wasn't just being hunted in the shadows. He was being painted as unstable, unreliable, dangerous to himself. The pressure mounted until paranoia became routine. He varied his driving routes. He checked his mirrors obsessively. He double-locked the doors, then triple-checked them. And still, the sense of being followed never left. But fear only sharpened his resolve. Malik understood something now. Whitmore was rattled. If his empire were truly untouchable, there'd be no reason for these games. The intimidation meant Malik was close. Closer than anyone had ever been. So he pushed harder. He dug deeper into Briggs' claims, pulling property records, insurance filings, and union complaints. That's when a pattern emerged. Dozens of machines lost in supposed accidents, each claim tied to a subsidiary shell company owned by Whitmore. Millions pocketed. And Darius Coleman's name, Malik's father's name, appeared again and again on the maintenance logs. The realization was devastating. Briggs hadn't lied. Darius had been involved. Maybe unwillingly, maybe trapped by circumstance, but his signature was there, tangled in Whitmore's fraud. Malik sat in his father's old recliner. Paper spread around him, the silence pressing in. For the first time, he asked himself a question he had avoided for years. Had his father's own compromises sealed their fate? The thought was unbearable, but he couldn't look away from the evidence. And Whitmore knew it. That night, Malik returned home to find something new waiting for him. Propped against the front door was a plain envelope. Inside was a single photo, Malik asleep in his own bed. He dropped it, his chest tightening, bile rising in his throat. Whoever had taken it had been inside his home, watching him, standing just feet away while he was defenseless. The message was no longer subtle. You're next. Malik realized then that he had two choices. He could give in, walk away, pretend ignorance, let the truth rot under Whitmore's empire. Or he could keep going, even if it meant risking everything. He picked up the photo, his hands trembling, but steady enough to fold it and slip it into his pocket. Fear would not end the story. If Whitmore wanted silence, Malik would give him the opposite. Because the one thing Malik still had, the one weapon Whitmore couldn't buy, silence or erase, was the truth. And Malik was ready to use it, even if it killed him. Malik hadn't slept properly in weeks. Each knock at the door, each unfamiliar car idling outside, made his heart leap. The shadows had grown longer in the Coleman home, and with them, the threat. Then came the call that would change everything. Agent Simone Harrington of the FBI spoke calmly over the phone, but Malik could hear the gravity beneath her words. Mr. Coleman, we've been reviewing your father's case. The wood chipper, the fragments, the insurance irregularities. It all points to a larger operation. We need your help. Malik hung up, his pulse racing. The federal government? After years of being dismissed, ignored and left alone with nightmares, someone was finally listening. The next morning, Malik met Harrington in a small, unassuming office downtown. She was sharp, deliberate, and radiated authority. Her first words cut straight to the point. Darius Coleman wasn't just a victim. He was also a witness. And that makes you, Malik, extremely important. The implications hit Malik like a freight train. Not only was Whitmore responsible for his parents' disappearance, but now Malik was part of a federal investigation into a criminal enterprise that stretched across the state. Simone laid out what they knew. Whitmore's operation was sophisticated, insidious. Machinery lost in accidents. Shell companies. Insurance claims inflated to the millions. And buried in it all were the trails of Darius Coleman, a technician who had noticed discrepancies, who had documented the machines, who had unknowingly placed himself directly in Whitmore's path. "Your father tried to protect his family," Harrington said. "But the moment he discovered the fraud, he became a threat. That's why he's gone. And we believe your mother suffered the same fate." Malik clenched his fists. He had spent years feeling powerless. Now, armed with federal backing, he felt a pulse of righteous fury. The FBI began tracing the network, following the paper trail, cross-referencing every insurance claim, every warehouse, every shell company. And then came the breakthrough. One of the warehouses Whitmore controlled, ostensibly for storing machinery, appeared to be active, not abandoned, not dormant, active. Malik joined the surveillance team. Hidden behind a cover of dusk, he watched as Whitmore's luxury sedan glided into the industrial park. Following closely was a large panel truck, the same type used to transport machinery for Whitmore's schemes. The tension was suffocating. Every muscle in Malik's body screamed at him to act, to charge in, to save what little remained of his family's honor. Harrington placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent reminder. Patience. Strategy. The hours stretched into the night. Inside the warehouse, men moved methodically, stacking machinery, counting crates, checking manifests. The scale of Whitmore's operation was staggering. Malik could see now why his father's discovery had been fatal. To expose Whitmore was to unravel an empire, and Whitmore had proven that no one, no family, and no moral compass could stand in his way. Then came the unexpected. A shadow detached itself from the main loading area. Malik recognized the broad shoulders, the gait, someone had seen before. It was Jory Pasternak, Whitmore's enforcer. Malik's stomach twisted. This was the man who had been responsible for the first real warning, the beatings, the intimidation that had shown Malik what happens to those who probe too deeply. Simone's team moved quickly, but Malik's heart raced faster than their approach. His father had faced Pasternak. Now he did too, but Malik wasn't just a son. He was a witness, a threat, and the last thread connecting the Colemans to the truth. Hours later, with the tactical team ready, Harrington gave the order. The silence of the industrial park shattered with breaching charges and the roar of comms radios. The element of surprise, the precision, and the overwhelming force hit the men inside like a storm. Malik stood behind the glass, watching. Whitmore froze near a makeshift office, Pasternak operating a forklift as if instinct could save him. But instinct, Malik realized, couldn't compete with coordinated justice. Within minutes, the warehouse was secured. Whitmore and Pasternak were in custody. Machinery, manifests, and hidden ledgers were seized. Malik's breath caught as he saw the rows of stolen equipment. Each piece a symbol agreed, each serial number a chain linking back to his father's death. But the victory was bitter. There were no smiles, no relief. Malik knew that within the warehouse lay the last traces of his parents' lives, documents, remnants, perhaps even evidence that could reveal the final moments of Darius and Tanisha. As Malik walked among the seized machinery, he understood the full horror of what his father had faced. The system wasn't just corrupt. It was designed to consume anyone who dared challenge it, especially a hard-working black family daring to rise above their assigned place. And beneath the adrenaline and the victory, a cold, quiet thought whispered through Malik's mind. Whitmore had made mistakes, but he hadn't been alone. Someone else had been orchestrating the shadows, keeping the enforcers in line, feeding him information. The conspiracy ran deeper than Malik could yet imagine. The fight wasn't over, and Malik wasn't finished. The warehouse had been cleared. Whitmore and Pasternak were in custody, their arrogance stripped away under the harsh glare of federal scrutiny. But for Malik, the victory fell hollow. The machinery, the manifests, the ledgers, they were tangible proof of Whitmore's greed and cruelty, yet they were only half the story. The other half still whispered from the shadows of his family's past. Agent Harrington pulled Malik aside in the makeshift command center. Her eyes were grave. "We found something in the back room, a ledger hidden behind false panels. It's not just a list of machinery. There are codes, entries, and notes, meticulous work. Whoever kept this wanted it to survive." Malik felt a chill. A ledger that had survived years of secrecy, a record of the empire that had killed his parents. It was his chance to finally understand. He leaned over the table, staring at the handwritten columns. The numbers were staggering. Millions in fraudulent claims, shell company transfers, machinery that had vanished from the books but still roamed job sites. And then he saw it, a column marked in faint ink. DC Inspection Notes. The initials hit him like a hammer. Darius Coleman. Malik's hands trembled. His father had left a trace. Hidden within Whitmore's operation, a trail only the Coleman's meticulous life could have produced. Darius hadn't been a bystander. He had been documenting, noting, logging every anomaly he could find, perhaps hoping to protect his family or to prepare a case for justice. But as Malik flipped further, his stomach sank. The ledger didn't just confirm Darius as a witness. It suggested active involvement. There were entries with calculations only someone intimately familiar with the machinery and the company could make, codes, hidden notations, even alternative accounts and risk projections. Malik stared at the page. The father he had idolized, the man who had been the foundation of his life, had been a participant, perhaps willingly, perhaps coerced, in the system that had ultimately destroyed him. The realization twisted Malik's heart. Could his father have done more? Could he have made a choice that fed Whitmore's empire, even unknowingly? "Malik," Harrington said, her voice cutting through his spiraling thoughts. "I know what you're seeing, and I know how it feels. But this doesn't erase your father. It doesn't excuse Whitmore. It's evidence of how deeply your father had to navigate to try and protect the people he loved." Malik nodded, though the knot in his chest tightened. He wanted to hate his father's memory, to blame him for leaving clues only Whitmore could manipulate. But the ledger also spoke of resistance, of coded warnings, of entries that seemed designed for someone else to find. Should Whitmore try to erase the Colemans entirely? The ledger became Malik's obsession. He spent hours cross-referencing the codes, the machinery, and the shell companies. Slowly, a picture emerged. Darius Coleman had known the exact scale of the fraud. He had known who profited, who enforced, who threatened, and he had tried to play a dangerous game. Every note, every observation in the ledger was a breadcrumb, a way to ensure that even if he disappeared, the truth could survive. But with each new revelation came a darker realization. Whitmore had known Darius's potential. Whitmore had sensed that the man could turn the ledger into a weapon. And that was why Darius and Tanisha had been targeted. Malik's resolve hardened. If his father had left the ledger as a safeguard, then Malik's job was clear. He wasn't just uncovering Whitmore's crimes. He was finishing his father's work. Yet, as he dug deeper, the ledger revealed one final, shocking twist. There was a section of transactions that didn't match any of the known shell companies or warehouses. Operations Malik had never heard of, machinery that had been moved under code names, and entries signed with Darius's initials. The handwriting was his father's, unmistakable, but the content suggested that Darius had, at some point, facilitated a move in the operation, not out of greed, not for profit, but to protect his family, to survive. Malik staggered back from the table. His father hadn't been a passive victim, but had he been complicit, even slightly, in the machinery of corruption that ultimately destroyed him? The revelation fractured Malik's certainty. His righteous anger at Whitmore's greed was now tangled with doubt about the father he had revered. Harrington placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You need to understand, Malik. In operations like Whitmore's, sometimes the only way to survive, even to try to save someone, is to play along until the moment you can strike. Your father was clever. He was brave, and he left a trail for you to finish what he started. Malik's jaw tightened. The ledger was more than a record. It was a map, a warning, a blueprint for justice. And in the margins, scribbled notes hinted at a location, a warehouse, one final piece of evidence that Whitmore thought was lost forever. The time for observation was over. Malik would have to step into the shadows, walk where his father had walked, and confront Whitmore's empire on his own terms. The game was no longer about discovery. It was about confrontation. And somewhere in that warehouse, somewhere in Whitmore's empire, the next move had already been set in motion. The ledger had spoken. It was no longer a collection of numbers and codes. It was a map, a confession, and a warning all at once. Malik traced the entries late into the night, the glow of his laptop illuminating the fatigue etched into his face. Each code, each reference to hidden warehouses, drew a thread that led into the darkest corners of Whitmore's empire. Harrington and the FBI had been watching Malik carefully. They recognized the intelligence in his pursuit. They had watched him connect that seasoned agents missed. But even the FBI couldn't navigate the layers of deception that Whitmore had built. Shell companies, unmarked trucks, hidden storage units. Not without Malik's insight. Finally, Malik found it. A warehouse code, scribbled in the margin with the initials DC. One location, isolated in the industrial sprawl south of Seattle, matched the pattern in the ledger. It was unassuming from the outside. Rusting metal doors, a cracked sign that had long since faded, no lights, no movement. But Malik knew what was inside. He could feel it in his bones. This was a final puzzle piece. The FBI began a full-scale surveillance operation. Drones circled overhead. Cameras were set, and tactical teams quietly set up observation points. Weeks of patience followed, monitoring every vehicle, every face, every delivery. Then, just before dawn one morning, the quiet was broken. A black sedan rolled into the lot. Two figures stepped out, one tall, broad-shouldered, moving with practiced caution. The other smaller, careful, surveying perimeter with keen eyes. The taller figure carried the unmistakable aura of authority, the muscle of Whitmore's operation, the one responsible for silencing anyone who got too close. Malik's pulse quickened. This was it. The confrontation he had been preparing for, the reckoning that his father's ledger had promised, was unfolding. But the FBI cautioned patience. One wrong move and everything, the evidence, the warehouses, the chance to uncover Tanisha's fate, could vanish forever. Hours passed as the two men entered the warehouse. Malik crouched behind the surveillance van, headphones pressed to his ears, listening to Harrington relay updates. The sound of heavy machinery moving, doors creaking, metal scraping on concrete. It was a grisly symphony, a reminder of the violence his family had endured. Then Malik noticed something unusual. One of the men, the smaller figure, was handling documents, flipping through papers with care. He wasn't moving equipment. He was reviewing records. And then Malik froze. The handwriting on the top sheet, meticulous, looping, unmistakable, was his father's. His mind raced. Darius Coleman had anticipated this. Even in death, he had left something for Malik to find, a safeguard embedded in Whitmore's own empire. But the sight also sparked fear. If Whitmore's men had access to his father's notes, did that mean someone else knew what Malik knew? Someone who might act before the FBI or Malik could make a move. The tension ratcheted higher when the taller man approached the smaller one. They argued quietly, their voices low but intense. Malik strained to hear. It's too risky. You know Whitmore won't forgive mistakes. The smaller figure responded, almost offensively. I'm just following orders. Keep the ledger hidden. Destroy what's left, and no one will connect us. Malik's heart pounded. The ledger wasn't just a map. It was proof. Proof of fraud, proof of murder, proof of the operation that had taken his parents. And now he realized they were moments away from destroying the final evidence. Harrington signaled the tactical team. It was time. The FBI had waited, watching, letting the suspects feel safe, until every piece of the puzzle was in place. Then, with the precision of trained soldiers, the dynamic entry began. Breaching charges exploded. Doors flew open. Lights blazed. Inside the warehouse, chaos erupted. The taller figure tried to grab the ledger. swinging a metal pipe to keep the agents back. Boxes crashed, the clatter echoing to the cavernous space. The smaller man scrambled, attempting to hide the papers and burn what he could. But Malik saw his chance. He darted forward, snatching the ledger before it vanished in flame. The taller man turned, eyes wild. "Step back. You don't know what you're taking." "I know exactly what I'm taking," Malik spat, voice steady despite the adrenaline, "and it's proof of everything you tried to hide. My parents didn't die for nothing." The FBI subdued the two men quickly, but Malik's eyes never left the ledger. Each page screamed a story of greed, corruption, and murder, and also, cryptically, of Darius Coleman's secret maneuvers. The realization hit Malik like a thunderclap. His father had played a dangerous game, navigating Whitmore's empire from the inside, documenting enough to bring the man down. If Malik had the courage and cunning to finish it, outside the warehouse, dawn broke, painting the concrete gray with streaks of gold. Malik held the ledger tightly, the weight of his parents' legacy pressing on him. They had trusted him, unknowingly, to complete what they could not. And now the real battle was just beginning, unraveling the full extent of Whitmore's crimes, confronting the corrupt elites who had treated his family as expendable, and discovering the ultimate fate of Tanisha Coleman. The ledger was his inheritance, his parents' secret, his mission, and Malik knew one thing with unshakable clarity. He would not fail. Malik sat in the dim glow of his apartment, the ledger splayed across his kitchen table, like a map of a dark, hidden world. The building around him was quiet. The distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog outside were the only reminders that life continued outside. But inside, Malik's reality had fractured. Nothing would ever be ordinary again. He traced the loops of his father's handwriting, careful not to miss a single note. Darius had been meticulous, not just documenting the machinery fraud, but annotating dates, serial numbers, shipment logs, and suspicious transfers between shell companies. Each page hinted at a man walking a razor's edge, balancing between survival and exposure. And then Malik noticed the margin notes, small, almost invisible annotations in the corner of certain pages. "Not yet. Watch carefully. Don't trust Whitmore. He'll kill to protect the ledger." Malik's pulse quickened. His father hadn't just recorded numbers. He had prepared a blueprint for survival, a warning written for the son, who might one day inherit the nightmare. As Malik decoded the notes, the reality sank in. Darius Coleman had not been entirely innocent. In the months leading up to his death, he had discovered the full scope of Sterling Whitmore's empire and had played a dangerous game of inside resistance. He hadn't just witnessed a fraud, he had subtly manipulated it, creating backdoors and evidence caches, ensuring that if something went wrong, the truth could still emerge. Malik felt a chill. He had always seen his father as incorruptible, a paragon of diligence and morality. But now he understood the nuances. Darius had been caught in a world where loyalty, fear, and survival collided. He had been part of the system, using his knowledge and position to protect his family while quietly gathering proof. It wasn't complicity born of greed. It was strategy. But the realization that his father had walked so close to danger, knowing the stakes, filled Malik with a mixture of awe and terror. Hours passed as Malik meticulously cataloged each entry. The ledger detailed the fraudulent machinery claims, showing how Whitmore reported excavators, bulldozers, and industrial presses as stolen or destroyed. Every claim had been inflated, every loss fabricated. The machinery hadn't disappeared. It had been hidden, shuffled between warehouses, sold in off-the-books transactions, and sometimes stripped for parts to fuel Whitmore's personal profits. And then Malik came to a section that froze him entirely. Darius had highlighted certain machinery, equipment that he had personally maintained, machines that would have revealed the discrepancies firsthand. And next to each entry, a single, terrifying word: target. Malik's heart raced. Target. His father had known that noticing the inconsistencies wasn't without consequence. He had feared that Whitmore would eliminate anyone who threatened the empire, and in those entries, he had predicted his own fate. And yet, Darius had pressed on, documenting the evidence, leaving breadcrumbs for Malik, for the world, if he didn't survive. The ledger also revealed that Tanisha had been in danger from the beginning. Notes referenced meetings, unexplained absences, and safe routine for his mother. Darius had meticulously mapped her movements, the routine she would follow when he suspected Whitmore's reach was expanding. Malik realized with a sinking stomach that his mother's disappearance had not been an afterthought. She had been a calculated target, a way to silence Darius entirely. The more Malik read, the more he understood the complexity of Whitmore's operation. It wasn't just fraud. It was a system designed to erase anyone who interfered. Employees, inspectors, technicians, all expendable, all at the mercy of a man who believed wealth and influence could shield him from consequences. And it wasn't just the machinery. Malik discovered entries referencing offshore accounts, untraceable transfers, and shell corporations scattered across the Pacific Northwest. Whitmore had created a labyrinth. Each twist and turn meant to obscure the trail, hide his profits, and eliminate those who might expose him. And then Malik stumbled upon the final, most chilling note. Unlike the others, it was not a technical entry or code. It was personal, written in his father's familiar, looping hand. It simply said, "Malik, if you are reading this, I did not survive. Trust no one completely. Follow the evidence. Find the truth. Finish what I could not." The words hit Malik like a physical blow. For years of searching, for years of hope and despair, all condensed into a single instruction. His father had anticipated his death, had planned for a son who might inherit the knowledge and the danger. Malik's hands trembled as he closed the ledger, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over him like a mantle he had never asked for. The ledger also revealed a shocking twist. Darius hadn't simply been an observer. He had, at times, acted as a reluctant enforcer. Certain entries detailed instances where he had manipulated machinery logs to protect himself and others, even creating false leads to misdirect Whitmore's attention. Malik struggled to reconcile this with the father he knew. Darius had been both hero and player in a game he had never wanted to join. The line between victim and participant blurred, complicating Malik's understanding of justice, morality, and his father's courage. Malik knew he had no time to dwell. Whitmore's network was still active. Surveillance of the warehouses indicated that the operation was ongoing, the machinery still being shuffled, still being disguised. And the enforcers, men like the one who had attacked Malik months earlier, were still at large, still loyal to Whitmore, still capable of violence. Determined, Malik contacted Harrington and the FBI. Together, they planned a coordinated strike, using the ledger as the key to dismantling Whitmore's operation. Malik would guide them to the maze his father had charted, each entry a step closer to both justice and the ultimate revelation of what had truly happened to Tanisha Coleman. But Malik also carried a personal burden, the knowledge of his father's hidden involvement in Whitmore's schemes. It wasn't just about exposing the man who had murdered his parents. It was about confronting the uncomfortable truth that Darius had walked a shadowed path to protect them, leaving Malik to navigate the moral gray zone left in his wake. As night fell, Malik looked out over the Seattle skyline. The city shimmered with lights, oblivious to the horrors hidden in its industrial shadows. He clenched the ledger tightly, feeling both fear and resolve surge through him. The next moves had to be precise. One wrong step could destroy the evidence. Whitmore could escape, and Malik's mother might remain lost forever. The ledger had revealed everything: the fraud, the murders, the lies, and Darius's secret role. Now it was up to Malik to finish the work, to honor his parents, to dismantle the empire that had tried to erase them, and to confront a system that had treated his family as expendable. And as Malik prepared for first strike against Whitmore's empire, a single, terrifying thought lingered in his mind. Darius had left a map of the enemy, but he had also left a warning. The closer Malik got to the truth, the more dangerous the world became. And some of the shadows in that world were closer than he realized. Malik's hand shook as he carried the ledger into the unmarked FBI van. Outside, the warehouse district lay under a heavy blanket of fog, the steel and concrete casting long, ominous shadows. Every muscle in his body was taut, born of 4 years of searching, for years of terror and grief, and months of painstaking investigation. Tonight, it would all come to a head. The operation was precise. FBI tactical teams moved in silence around perimeter, while Malik guided agents through Sterling Whitmore's labyrinthine empire. Every shell company, every unmarked warehouse, Every coded transfer documented in his father's ledger had been mapped. Every clue had a purpose. Inside the largest warehouse, Whitmore's empire was laid bare. Rows of heavy machinery gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights. Excavators, industrial presses, bulldozers, all marked for fraud, hidden for profit. Pallets of shipping crates bore offshore company names, ready to vanish into a network of corruption stretching far beyond Washington. The evidence was undeniable. Whitmore was there, pacing. He wore arrogance like armor, a suit more expensive than Malik's apartment, cufflinks gleaming. But tonight, the armor was brittle. Surveillance cameras monitored every move, and Whitmore's enforcers had been neutralized. For the first time, the untouchable man was cornered. Whitmore's gaze snapped to Malik. "I've been expecting someone like you," he said, voice smooth but venomous. "Your father, clever but careless." Malik's stomach tightened. "You killed my parents. You tried to erase them. And you underestimated us." Whitmore's smirk faltered as agents surrounded him, ordering him to raise his hands. But he wasn't alone. From the shadows, a former lieutenant emerged, a double dealer. Malik froze. The ledger had led them here, but not every shadow was accounted for. "Move slowly," Malik whispered, signaling the tactical team. The lieutenant tried to flee. 2 agents intercepted him. The betrayal cut deep. Inside the warehouse, Whitmore attempted a desperate escape, but the FBI had secured every exit. Malik watched as a man who had built his empire on others' bones was stripped of power. Handcuffs clicked, echoing judgment through the cavernous space. The victory was bittersweet. The ledger had led them here, but Tanisha Coleman's fate was unknown. Agents searched methodically. Hidden behind a false wall, they found a small, sealed container. Malik's heart pounded. Inside were personal effects, a scarf, a necklace, and documents proving Tanisha had been held as secondary Whitmore site. She had survived barely. Malik's hand shook as he held the scarf, the same one from the abandoned car years ago. Tears came unbidden. His father's foresight had worked. His parents were both targets, but Tanisha had survived, hidden until justice arrived. Whitmore faced relentless interrogation. His empire collapsed. The network that treated black workers as expendable pawns was dismantled. Malik spent days with Tanisha, listening as she recounted months of captivity, isolation, and fear. But she had hope, survival, the ledger, and Malik's persistence had restored justice. The ledger also revealed a truth Malik had feared. His father had been active in manipulating Whitmore's operations, a reluctant participant. Darius had acted strategically, ethically gray in a battle for survival, protecting his family while gathering proof that would bring justice. Heroism was rarely clean. Courage often came with compromise. Whitmore faced multiple charges: first-degree murder, massive industrial fraud, conspiracy, intimidation. The prosecution presented the ledger alongside Darius's remains, Tanisha's personal items, and testimony from former enforcers. Whitmore's arrogance eroded under irrefutable evidence. He was sentenced to life without parole. Jory Pasternak, Whitmore's enforcer, faced decades. Malik's confrontation with him was brief, eyes meeting across the courtroom. There was no vengeance, only acknowledgement. Justice, delayed but inexorable. Malik emerged into the crisp Seattle air with Tanisha by his side. For years of uncertainty, grief, and relentless pursuit of truth had transformed him. He had learned the weight of moral complexity and the devastating cost of systemic corruption. The twist, that his father had not been entirely uninvolved, reshaped Malik's understanding of heroism. Darius had been both participant and resistor, protector and strategist. His cunning had saved Tanisha, brought down Whitmore, and restored dignity to a family the system had tried to erase. As Malik and Tanisha walked home that evening, city lights reflected in puddles from an earlier rainstorm. Shadows stretched long, but the darkness no longer felt oppressive. They had survived, fought back, and exposed the truth. The ledger, once a cryptic map of danger, was now a testament, a warning, a guide, and a monument to resilience. Malik understood the fight was over, but the lessons endured. The Colemans had not been erased. They had endured, and justice had finally been done.